Please be seated. For he is our peace, and in his flesh he has made both groups into one, and has broken down the dividing wall, that is, the hostility between us. It was about 1983 that the blues musician Daryl Davis was playing at a place called the Silver Dollar Lounge in Maryland. This lounge was in the first floor of a truck stop motel. And during the break, a man came up to him and said, "I really like the way you're playing the piano. Would you come to my table and have a drink? I'll buy you a drink." Now, there are a couple unusual things about this encounter. The first was that Daryl Davis was a blues musician, but he at that time was playing with a country music band in a country music bar. And this was because back in the early 80s, if you were around, country music had made a big comeback. There was a movie, Urban Cowboy, with John Travolta, and all of a sudden all these bars were playing country music. And so if you wanted, like Daryl Davis did, to have a full-time job as a musician, you had to learn to play country music. Now, the second unusual thing about this encounter was that the man who had come up to Daryl Davis and said, "I really like your playing. Come sit down, have a drink with me. I'll buy you a drink." That man, it turned out, was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And at the end of their conversation, this gentleman told Daryl Davis, who was African American, he said, "Here's my card. When your band is next in town, I want you to give me a call. I really like your playing. I'm going to bring some of my friends to hear you play." And by friends, he meant other members of the KKK. And it was at this moment that Daryl Davis began quite an unusual hobby. He began to form relationships with members of the Ku Klux Klan. One member was a national leader, what they call an imperial wizard. Another member was a high-ranking official in the Maryland State KKK. This guy actually also was a Baltimore City police officer, and he later went to prison twice, once for conspiring to bomb a synagogue, and another time for attacking two African-American men. But Daryl Davis, by not standing on a high horse, but just listening to these guys in humility, calling them up and saying, "Hey, what are you doing today? Let's go to Home Depot, or let's have a meal together, or let's talk about some of your ideas." He began to form a relationship with members of the KKK, and not just a relationship, he actually became friends with some of them. And I think his example shows us what you can do if you reach out to someone, not in self-righteousness and saying you are a terrible person, but just with a little bit of humility and respect, and you say, "Come, I want to hear you and you hear me on equal level." Now, I have a question. How can we, sitting here today, be more like Daryl Davis? Is that possible? Because I think if we could be more like him, I think our world would be a lot better place. We'd have a lot more love and understanding if we could, across differences, either across racial lines or perhaps, with our Muslim visitors here, across religious lines, form these bonds of understanding. I think the world would be a better place. The problem is, of course, is that I don't know about you, but let's talk about me. I can barely, on Facebook, restrain myself from going crazy when I see some dumb comment written there, and that's usually from my friends. So how likely is it that I could respond to someone who explicitly hates me because of my race and wants to do violence to me? Could I really respond with grace and love and humility? Or would I respond with anger and hatred and fear? So is there a way for us to become more like Daryl Davis? When we look at Paul's letter to the Ephesians today, scholars are divided as to whether Paul actually wrote this letter. And that's because of the style of the letter. It's unusual for his writings. It's very long sentences. It feels like a first draft. But what's interesting about the passage today is Paul uses a lot of redundancies. He repeats different words for the same concept. And in our passage today, Paul uses two very, very rare Greek words that mean wall, dividing wall, talking about the division between the Jews and the Gentiles. And one thing we think this dividing wall refers to is in the Temple of Jerusalem. Now, in the Temple of Jerusalem, it was built with concentric circles of holiness. So the very center of the temple was the most holy place. That was called the Holy of Holies. And once a year, only one man, the high priest, could go in just one day, once a year, into the Holy of Holies. That was the most holy place. And then on the outside, right outside of that, you had the court of the priests. That's where the priests could be. And then the ring outside of that was where the men could be, the Jewish men, and then the Jewish women. And then the very outside, the courtyard of the Gentiles, they called it. That's where the non-Jews were allowed to be. And what separated that courtyard from the rest of the holy parts of the temple was a wall. So perhaps Paul is referring to this wall, this physical symbol of a division between Jews and Greeks. But Paul also could have been referring to how Jews separated themselves, distinguished themselves from the pagans around them. And that was through following the law, the Jewish Torah. And especially for the Jews who do not live in Palestine, but lived, say, in the diaspora, in Egypt, in Syria, they considered the law a fence or a hedge, a way for them to protect themselves from corrupting Gentile influences. But in either case, whether we think about a physical wall or a metaphoric wall, we're talking about social segregation. And this reminds me of something one of these KKK members said to Daryl Davis. He said, you know, I'm not a white supremacist. Now, some of these KKK members definitely were. They were like, absolutely the white race is the superior race. But this guy said, no, I'm actually not. I'm a white separatist. I believe that the races should be separate. Not that one is necessarily better than the other, but that they should be separate. And I don't want to push this too far, but this is sort of what Paul is talking about in Ephesians. This wall between the Jews and the Gentiles. There is a separation between them. And let us look now as to how that separation, that wall, is destroyed. What does Paul say? He has broken down the dividing wall, the hostility between us. Who is that? That is Jesus. In other words, we don't do it. It's Jesus who tears down the wall, not you and not me. And the implication of this is very profound. What this means is that if you and I want to go through life and tear down the wall of hatred that separates groups, if you want to be like Daryl Davis and show love to people who absolutely hate you, then you first need to let Jesus into your life. Because it is Jesus who is the author of this work of reconciliation, not you and not me. Let's think about an apple tree. So if you go and plant an apple tree, you can't force that tree to give you fruit. You can't will the tree to give you fruit. You have to wait. You have to plant it and wait, and then one day it'll grow, the tree will grow, and some fruit will ripen. Analogously, we cannot force ourselves to become a guy like Daryl Davis. We cannot will ourselves to have his moral courage. But what we can do, as Paul tells the Ephesians, what we can do is to let Jesus into our lives, form a relationship with him that over time, good fruit will develop. And over time, we will be transformed to become people who can love our enemies, just like Daryl Davis. And how do we let Jesus into our lives? Well, one classic way is to pray. And maybe you don't like that word prayer because it triggers something about church that you remember from when you were younger. That's fine. Let's call it something different. Quiet time. Or even better, let's call it meditation. So what we need to do is spend a little bit of time, meditation, with Jesus every day. And slowly, not overnight, but slowly, we will create this good fruit. Good fruit will bloom within us, and we will be able to return love when we are hated, because it is Jesus who does this work, not us. You know, for many years I was an atheist, and I did not believe in Christianity or God. And when I was in that moment in my life, I often thought of Christianity as having two parts. This core of sensible, ethical guidelines that I could make sense of, and then this strange metaphysical doctrines like the resurrection or that Jesus was the Son of God. And so I could understand why people throughout history have wanted to isolate this core doctrine, what they call ethical culture, and say, yes, this is what's important about Christianity, and all the rest of it, all that stuff about Jesus is the Son of God, was born from a virgin, the resurrection, we don't need any of that. You know, we can have the golden rule without the resurrection. But I'm afraid that I had it backwards, and if you think that way, you actually have it backwards too. Because what we see in the passage today is that Christians know that any ethical behavior that we exhibit, anything good that we do, comes out of a radical dependence on Jesus. It is not us, it is Jesus. And without Jesus, without that whole metaphysical package, the Son of God, the resurrection, we really can't do much. And I want to conclude with an illustration that Daryl Davis gave that I think shows his point well. So he was talking to a KKK member about the burning cross. You know, the KKK, they call themselves a Christian organization. So Daryl said to this Klan member, why then do you guys burn the cross? That doesn't make any sense to me. You guys are supposedly Christian. And this person said, oh, that's easy, okay. Two reasons. One, fire is a pure symbol of purification. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to purify our society. But another is that, you believe, Daryl, as I do, as Christians, that Jesus will come back. And he's like, yeah. And so we light the cross on fire because that's our way to light the way for Jesus, to show him the way back. And Davis thought about this for a moment and said, well, we must believe in different Jesus Christ. There must be at least two. And the Klan member said, no, of course not. How is that even possible? And Davis said, well, you said that you need to light the way for your Jesus Christ. But my Jesus Christ lights the way for me. Exactly. Davis understood the truth. It is not us that does this work. It is Jesus. It is Jesus who is the light of the world, who destroys the darkness, the one who breaks down the walls of hatred, the one who can bring peace and love between enemies.